The sun sets over Oaxaca with a particular kind of resignation, as if it knows something we don't. As twilight deepens across the colonial facades and ancient stonework, the city transforms. Shadows pool in doorways that have stood for centuries, and the temperature drops just enough to make your skin prickle. The tourists photograph the fading light on Santo Domingo Church, unaware that beneath their feet extends a network of passages older than the Spanish conquest, older perhaps than memory itself. The tunnels under Oaxaca are not a secret, not exactly. They appear on some maps, mentioned briefly in historical texts. But ask the wrong questions about them, press too hard about what lies in the deeper sections, and you'll watch the locals' faces close like shutters before a storm. Conversations end. Eyes shift away. The people who have lived above these passages for generations suddenly remember appointments elsewhere. This is not the polite deflection of tourism fatigue. This is the careful silence of people who have learned through means they will not discuss that some things are better left unspoken. We came to Oaxaca following a pattern that seemed impossible to ignore. Over the past 15 years, more than 30 psychics, mediums, and self-described sensitives have traveled to this city, drawn by what they describe as a magnetic pull. They come from different countries, different backgrounds, speaking different languages. Most have never communicated with each other. Yet, when interviewed separately, they describe the same vision with unsettling precision. Something ancient waits in the darkness below. Something that predates the Zapotec, the Mixtec, even the earliest civilizations we have named. Something that has been waiting with the patience of stone and the hunger of a wound that never heals. The disappearances started long before anyone thought to connect them. A university student researching colonial architecture in 2007. A spelunker mapping historical sites in 2011. 3 amateur historians in 2014, last seen near the Old Market District with maps of the underground aqueduct system. The official explanations vary. Accidents. Migrants moving on. Personal crises. But the families whisper about the tunnels, about the places where their loved ones were last seen, always near entrances to the underground, always at twilight. We will take you into those passages. We will show you what the psychic saw, what the missing were seeking, and what the locals have protected through their silence. This is not a story about folklore kept safely in the past. This is about something that waits in the dark beneath a living city, something that has touched the modern world with consequences we are only beginning to understand. The descent begins here, as darkness falls over Oaxaca, and the city above grows quiet, and the tunnels below, according to those who claim to sense such things, begin to wait. In the highlands of Oaxaca, beneath the ancient city of Monte Alban, there exist passages that predate the Spanish conquest by more than 1,000 years. The Zapotec and Mixtec peoples who built this ceremonial center spoke in hushed tones of the Yahuali-Catl, the night wind beings, entities that existed in the liminal space between the living world and the realm of the dead. These were not gods in the traditional sense, but something older, something that required no worship, only respect and distance. They were said to guard chambers deep within the earth, places where the boundaries between worlds grew thin and permeable. The name itself carries weight. Yahuali means night in the Nahuatl language, but in the earlier Zapotec tongue, the concept encompassed more than mere darkness. It spoke of the absence of sight, the realm where human perception fails and other senses must guide the way. Cattle, the wind, represented breath, spirit, movement without form. Together, the night wind beings embodied the invisible forces that moved through the sacred underground, entities that could be felt but never fully seen, heard in the echo of footsteps through stone corridors, but never directly confronted. The Zapotec builders of Monte Alban understood architectural principles that seem almost impossible for their era. They carved chambers from solid rock, created ventilation systems that still function after nearly 2 millennia, and constructed drainage networks that demonstrate sophisticated engineering knowledge. But certain chambers were different. These rooms, found in the deepest sections of the complex, featured doorways sealed not with stone blocks, but with elaborate combinations of symbols, glyphs that served no decorative purpose and told no historical narrative. These were warnings, containment measures, spiritual barriers erected not to keep thieves out, but to keep something in. When the Spanish arrived in the valley of Oaxaca in the 1530s, they found Monte Alban already abandoned, its great plazas empty and its temples silent. The Zapotec people had moved to other settlements, but they maintained certain traditions, certain prohibitions about the old city, and especially about the tunnels beneath it. The conquistadors, driven by rumors of hidden gold and lost treasures, largely ignored these warnings. But the missionaries who followed, men tasked with converting the indigenous population and documenting their customs, could not ignore what they witnessed. The most detailed accounts come from a Dominican friar named Diego de Mendoza, who worked in the region during the 1580s. His letters, now preserved in the Archive of the Indies in Seville, describe events that troubled him deeply enough to report to his superiors in Spain. In the summer of 1582, de Mendoza documented an incident involving 3 fellow priests who had ventured into the tunnel system beneath Monte Alban against the advice of their indigenous guide. They sought to map the passages, to understand the full extent of the ancient city, perhaps to locate storage chambers that might hold pagan idols for destruction. They entered in the morning and did not emerge until dusk of the following day, nearly 36 hours later. De Mendoza writes that when they finally surfaced, their clothing was torn, their hands bloodied from scraping against stone walls, and their eyes held what he described as a terrible vacancy. For the first hours after their emergence, none of the 3 could speak coherently. They babbled in what initially seemed to be nonsense, but which the Zapotec witnesses identified as fragments of the old language, words and phrases that had not been spoken openly in generations. One priest, Father Sebastian de Torres, continued speaking in this unknown tongue for 3 full days. De Mendoza transcribed what he could, showing the phonetic renderings to indigenous informants who grew visibly distressed. According to these sources, de Torres was speaking the language of the guardians, using phrases of greeting and supplication that were reserved for addressing the Yohuali Ehecatl. He spoke of communion with shadowy forms, of beings that moved through the darkness with purpose and intelligence, of voices that echoed from the stone itself. When de Torres finally regained his normal faculties, he claimed no memory of the underground journey beyond the first few chambers. He remembered descending stone stairs that seemed to spiral endlessly downward, passing through rooms decorated with murals depicting strange hybrid creatures, beings with human bodies, but faces obscured by swirling clouds. Then, he said, the torches they carried began to gutter and die despite having fresh fuel, and in the growing darkness they heard breathing that did not come from any of their party. After that, his memory contained only fragments. Cold air moving against his skin, the sensation of being watched from multiple directions simultaneously, and voices speaking in a language he did not know but somehow understood. The other 2 priests offered similar accounts, though their details diverged in troubling ways. They could not agree on how many chambers they had passed through, or whether they had stayed together throughout the ordeal, or even which direction they had traveled within the maze of passages. Their watches, mechanical devices brought from Europe, had all stopped at different times, suggesting some force within the tunnels that affected even metal and gears. De Mendoza, disturbed by these events, attempted his own cautious exploration of the tunnel entrances. He was accompanied by armed guards and indigenous guides who agreed to take him only to the uppermost levels of the complex. Even in these relatively accessible areas, he noted architectural features that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. Passages would branch and then reconnect in ways that created loops and dead ends. Chambers would open into one another through multiple doorways, making it difficult to track which rooms had already been visited. And everywhere, carved into the stone at irregular intervals, were the warning glyphs. Working with Zapotec informants who still remembered the old traditions, de Mendoza attempted to understand these symbols. What he learned convinced him that certain tunnels should never be explored. The glyphs, he wrote, were not merely warnings, but active spiritual barriers, prayers in stone meant to reinforce the seals on specific chambers. They spoke of things that should not be disturbed, of sleepers who must not be awakened, of guardians who served a purpose that transcended human understanding. Colonial-era maps of Monte Alban from this period reveal a curious pattern. Official Spanish surveys of the site, created for administrative and military purposes, show the major plazas, the ball courts, the temple platforms. They indicate some tunnel entrances, but notably omit entire sections of the underground complex. More intriguing are the private maps created by individual explorers and treasure seekers. Documents that only came to light centuries later in private collections and church archives. These maps show passages the official surveys ignored, but they mark certain branches with symbols that appear nowhere else in Spanish colonial cartography. These symbols, small crosses surrounded by rays or sometimes more abstract geometric patterns, appear to be warnings. Annotations in the margins of some maps, written in an archaic Spanish, advise avoiding these marked passages. One map, from 1597, includes a note in Latin that translates roughly to, "Here the guardians walk." Entry brings madness and the loss of the Christian soul. Another, dated 1603, simply marks a deep chamber with the word containment and the instruction to seal the entrance with blessed mortar. The question these maps raise is profound. What did the Spanish explorers find in these tunnels that convinced them not merely to avoid certain passages, but to actively work to seal them? Colonial records mention several instances of tunnel entrances being deliberately collapsed or filled with rubble, work that required significant effort and resources. This was not the casual blocking of a dangerous passage but systematic containment, as if something specific needed to be kept isolated. Indigenous oral traditions, recorded by later anthropologists in the 19th and 20th centuries, provide possible answer. The Zapotec and Mixtec peoples maintained stories about the deepest chambers of Monte Alban, rooms that existed before their ancestors built the city above. These chambers, according to legend, had always been there, carved from the living rock by earlier people whose names were forgotten. When the Zapotec built their great city, they did so knowing that the guardians already dwelt below, and they constructed their temples and palaces in relationship to these older sacred spaces, creating a cosmological map that linked the world of the living with the realm of the night wind beings. The guardians were not evil in the human sense, but they were profoundly other. They existed to maintain boundaries, to ensure that certain doorways remained closed, to prevent the living from accessing knowledge and power that would corrupt or destroy them. To encounter the Yohuali Ahekatl was to brush against forces that existed outside normal causation, beings that moved through time and space in ways that human minds could not process without damage. Why were certain chambers sealed with symbols meant to contain rather than protect? The answer lies in understanding what those chambers held. They were not treasure vaults or burial rooms, but thresholds, places where the membrane between worlds had worn dangerously thin. The guardians maintained watch over these thresholds, but even their vigilance had limits. The seals, both the original Zapotec barriers and the later Spanish reinforcements, were not meant to keep people out so much as to keep something else from coming through. They were collaborative acts of containment, indigenous wisdom, and colonial fear finding common ground in the recognition that some doors, once opened, cannot easily be closed again. The legacy of the night wind beings persists in the valley of Oaxaca. Local guides who take tourists through the mapped and sanctioned portions of Monte Alban will sometimes mention, usually in lowered voices, that the deepest tunnels remain unexplored by modern archaeologists, despite sophisticated equipment and legal permission to excavate. They speak of research teams that begin ambitious underground surveys only to abandon them after a few days, citing equipment failures or structural instability. They mention the persistent reports of strange sounds emanating from sealed passages during certain times of year, sounds that electronic recording equipment captures as nothing more than wind through cracks in ancient stone, though those who hear them directly insist they are something more deliberate, more intentional. The Yohuali Ahekatl ask nothing of us except acknowledgement and respect. They do not seek worship or sacrifice. They simply continue their ancient task, guarding boundaries that were old when the Spanish first saw the Pacific Ocean, maintaining seals that keep the living world separate from realms we were never meant to enter. The tunnels beneath Monte Alban remain, dark and labyrinthine, holding secrets that perhaps should stay hidden. And somewhere in those depths, if the legends hold any truth, the night wind beings still walk their eternal rounds, patient and implacable, waiting in the darkness they have claimed as their own. The seven of them met for the first time in the lobby of a modest hotel on the outskirts of Oaxaca City on the morning of March 19, 1994. They came from different countries, spoke different languages, practiced different spiritual traditions. Yet when they looked at each other across that cramped, tiled space, there was instant recognition. The kind that makes the skin prickle with something deeper than coincidence. Margaret Chen, a dental hygienist from Vancouver, had booked her flight 3 weeks earlier after waking from the same dream 7 nights in a row. Sarah Volkman, who ran a small bookshop in Portland, had liquidated her savings account and driven south without telling her family where she was going. There was Javier Menendez from Buenos Aires, a former accountant who had abandoned his practice. Priya Nambiar, a university student from London who had missed her final exams. David Kessler, a construction worker from Phoenix. Yuki Tanaka, a translator from Oaxaca. And Elena Rusu, a nurse from Bucharest. None of them identified publicly as psychics. None had sought media attention or claimed special abilities. According to family members interviewed years later, these were ordinary people leading unremarkable lives until something reached out across the distance and touched them all at once. The dreams began in late February of that year. Each of them described it with eerie consistency, though they had never met, never corresponded, never shared their experiences until that morning in Oaxaca. The vision always started the same way. Darkness first, total and complete, the kind of blackness that has weight and texture. Then, slowly, 2 points of light emerging from that void. Not warm light, but something that reflected rather than radiated. Obsidian eyes, they all called them, though none could explain how they knew the material. Volcanic glass, polished to a mirror sheen, catching light that had no source. The figure attached to those eyes never fully materialized. Witnesses described a presence, a shape that suggested humanoid form without committing to specifics. Tall, they said. Impossibly tall, or perhaps the perspective was distorted in that dream space where normal dimensions collapsed into something more fluid. The figure never spoke in words. Instead, there was a knowing that downloaded directly into consciousness. A geographic coordinate that embedded itself so precisely that each of them could have drawn the same map. The Church of Santo Domingo in Oaxaca City. Beneath it, tunnels. Within those tunnels, a specific entrance marked by 3 stones arranged in descending size. David Kessler's sister was the one who finally agreed to speak on record, though she requested her full name not be used. She remembered the morning her brother announced he was leaving for Mexico. He had always been the practical one in the family, she said. Military service, steady work, a small house he was fixing up himself. He was not the kind of man who believed in visions or answered mysterious calls. But that morning at breakfast, he told her he had no choice. Those were his exact words. No choice. As if the decision had been made by something outside his own will. Margaret Chen's husband reported similar language. She had tried to ignore the dreams at first, attempted to rationalize them as stress or indigestion. But the visions intensified. They began occurring during waking hours. She would be in the middle of cleaning someone's teeth and suddenly find herself frozen, staring into those obsidian eyes, feeling the pull toward a place she had never been. The compulsion became physical. Headaches that painkillers could not touch. A sensation she described as being tugged from the inside, as if her organs were magnetized toward some distant pole. The others told similar stories to the family members they confided in. The visions came with increasing frequency and intensity. Sleep became impossible. Food lost its taste. Everything in their lives became gray and distant, except for the bright, terrible clarity of that calling. They had to go. The alternative was a kind of madness, a fracturing of self that terrified them more than any journey to a foreign country, to meet strangers and crawl into tunnels beneath a colonial church. So they came, following coordinates downloaded into their dreams. And when they saw each other in that hotel lobby, there was relief first. Validation that they were not, perhaps, insane. At least not alone in their insanity. They spent the first day comparing notes. A researcher later gained access to a journal that Sarah Volkman had kept during this period. Her entries from that day documented the conversation. Each person recounting their experience, the others nodding in recognition at every detail. The obsidian eyes, always those eyes. The sense of age emanating from the figure, something so old it predated language. The location information, precise down to the arrangement of stones. And strangest of all, the date. Each of them had understood, without being told in words, that they needed to arrive by March 20th. The Church of Santo Domingo sits in the heart of Oaxaca's historic center, a Baroque masterpiece built by Dominican friars in the 1600s. But the site itself is older. The church was constructed atop pre-Hispanic structures, built over and into the sacred geography of the Zapotec civilization that had dominated the valley for over a millennia. Local historians have long known about the tunnel systems beneath the building. Some were natural cave formations, expanded and connected by pre-Columbian engineers. Others were dug during the colonial period, used for storage, possibly for hiding during periods of conflict. By 1994, most of these passages had been sealed, filled in, or deemed too unstable for exploration. The 7 of them arrived at the church as evening services were ending. According to witness statements from a groundskeeper who saw them, they moved with purpose, walking directly to a section of the exterior wall on the north side of the building. There, partially hidden by vegetation and crumbling masonry, they found exactly what their visions had shown them. 3 stones, arranged in descending size, marking an entrance that had been forgotten or deliberately obscured. The groundskeeper, an elderly man named Hector Morales, watched them begin to clear the entrance. He called out, warning them that the tunnels were dangerous, that people had died in cave-ins decades ago, but they did not seem to hear him. He described their movements as synchronized, almost mechanical. They worked together without speaking, as if following a script only they could read. Morales reported the activity to church officials, but by the time anyone responded, the 7 had disappeared into the darkness beneath the church. They had brought flashlights, rope, water, dartway. They were prepared for an expedition, though none of them had caving experience or proper equipment. Yuki Tanaka had purchased a handheld video camera, one of those bulky models from the early 90s. That camera would become crucial evidence, though what it recorded raised more questions than it answered. They descended into a passage that sloped downward at a sharp angle. The stone was worked in some places, natural in others. Pre-Hispanic markings were visible on certain walls, geometric patterns, and stylized figures that none of them could interpret. The air grew cold and damp. Their lights carved small pockets of visibility from an oppressive darkness that seemed to resist illumination. According to the testimony later given by Javier Menendez, they walked for what felt like hours, though he could not be certain of time in that lightless space. The passage branched and reconnected, a maze that should have confused them, but they moved without hesitation. The same compulsion that had brought them to Oaxaca now pulled them deeper. They were being guided, he said, led towards something. The video footage that survived shows the moment when the passage opened into a larger chamber. The camera's light sweeps across walls that glitter with mineral deposits, across a floor littered with fragments of pottery and bone. And then, the light catches something else, a shape in the far corner of the chamber. The footage becomes erratic here, shaking violently. Audio captures screaming, not words but raw sounds of terror. The image blurs, goes dark, then shows only Yuki's face for a moment, eyes wide, mouth open. Then the camera drops. The recording continues for another 37 seconds, showing only the stone floor and the sound of running footsteps echoing in the chamber. Only 4 of them made it back to the surface. Javier Menendez, Sarah Falkman, Margaret Chen, and David Kessler emerged from the tunnel entrance at dawn on March 21st. Church workers found them sitting against the exterior wall, covered in dirt and scrapes, staring at nothing. None of them spoke coherently for the first several hours. When local authorities and eventually federal investigators questioned them, their stories fragmented into contradictory accounts. Menendez claimed they had encountered the figure from their visions, that it had been waiting in that chamber, exactly as promised. But seeing it in physical space, rather than in dreams, had broken something fundamental in their perception. The obsidian eyes, he said, reflected things that had not yet happened. Futures that should not be visible. Timelines, branching and collapsing. He used the phrase, looking into the mind of God, before he stopped speaking entirely. Sarah Volkmann's account was different. She insisted they had found nothing in the chamber, that the darkness itself had become sentient, had reached into their minds and shown them things personal and terrible. Memories that were not their own. Knowledge they had no framework to process. She described a sensation of being unmade and reconstructed, of having her consciousness pulled apart and examined by something that did not understand or care about human fragility. Margaret Chen spoke only once to investigators, through a translator, before her mental state deteriorated completely. She said they had been expected, that the chamber was a meeting place, not a destination, that they were supposed to serve a function, to carry something back with them. When asked what they were meant to carry, she began screaming and could not be calmed. David Kessler refused to describe what he saw. He would only repeat that they should not have gone, that the visions were not an invitation but a warning, and they had misunderstood everything. Priya Nambiar, Yuki Tanaka, and Elena Rusu never emerged from the tunnels. Rescue teams searched for days, mapping passages that went far deeper and more extensive than any official records suggested. They found Yuki's video camera, the tape still inside. They found scattered personal items belonging to the missing three, but no bodies, no indication of what had happened to them. The passages eventually became too unstable to continue searching. They were sealed with concrete and rebar. Elena Rusu's mother hired a private investigator who worked the case for 2 years before giving up. The investigator's final report, obtained through a Freedom of Information request, concluded that the three had either found an exit that led elsewhere or had died in a collapse that buried all evidence. But he noted something strange in his personal notes. Local cave experts who had assisted in the search reported feeling watched in certain passages, equipment malfunctions in specific chambers, a sense that the tunnels themselves did not want to be explored. Javier Menendez was institutionalized 6 weeks after the expedition. His diagnosis listed acute psychotic disorder with paranoid features. Medical records indicate he believed he was being followed by the figure with obsidian eyes, that it had followed him back from the tunnels and was waiting for something. He remained hospitalized until his death from heart failure in 2003. He was 41 years old. Margaret Chen was committed to psychiatric care in Vancouver after attempting to return to Oaxaca 3 times in the span of a month. Her husband had her passport confiscated. She became convinced that the others, the ones who did not make it out, were still calling to her. "Still down there," she would say. "Still waiting for us to understand." She died in institutional care in 2007, officially from complications of pneumonia, though her medical file documented years of self-harm and suicide attempts. Sarah Volkman returned to Portland but never reopened her bookshop. Neighbors reported seeing lights on in her apartment at all hours. She was spotted buying dozens of notebooks, filling them with writing that witnesses described as obsessive and illegible. In November of 1995, she disappeared. Her apartment was found neat and orderly, no signs of struggle or hurried departure. On her desk was a single sheet of paper with an address in Oaxaca and the words "I understand now." She has never been found. David Kessler is the only survivor who remains alive and outside institutional care. He returned to Phoenix, quit his construction job, and moved to rural Montana. He has refused all interview requests, all contact from researchers and journalists. A producer for a podcast about unsolved mysteries managed to reach him by phone in 2018. Kessler listened to the producer's questions in silence, then said only this: "We opened a door that was meant to stay closed. Some of us are still trying to close it. Leave us alone." He hung up and has not responded to any contact since. But the recorded testimonies exist, taken in the days immediately after the 4 survivors emerged, before their minds fully processed or suppressed what had happened. Audio tapes sitting in archives, their voices raw and shaking, describing impossible geometries in the chamber walls, the sensation of time moving differently underground, the certainty that the figure with obsidian eyes was not a being from elsewhere, but something that had always been there, beneath Oaxaca, beneath human history, waiting in the dark with patience that could outlast civilizations. And still, the question remains unanswered. What did they really find in those tunnels beneath the Church of Santo Domingo? What fractured their minds so completely that death and madness became preferable to remembering? The official records are sealed. The tunnels are filled with concrete. The 3 who never returned are still listed as missing persons, cases cold and abandoned. But sometimes, according to local sources, people report dreams. Visions of a tall figure with eyes like polished obsidian, calling out across the distance. Most ignore them. Most turn away. But every few years, Someone books a ticket to Oaxaca. Someone arrives asking questions about tunnels beneath old churches. And the people who remember 1994 feel that old fear return, the knowledge that some callings never end, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be sealed. The smell always comes first. That's what they tell you when you ask about the Tunnel Nahual. Before the footsteps echo through the darkness, before the temperature drops, before your flashlight begins to flicker and dim, there's the unmistakable scent of copal incense. Sweet and resinous, like burning tree sap mixed with something ancient and ceremonial. It fills your lungs and clings to your clothes, and by the time you recognize it, some say it's already too late to turn back. The tunnel system beneath the city has been expanding since the early 2000s, a sprawling network of maintenance corridors, drainage systems, and abandoned construction projects that honeycomb the earth beneath bustling streets and modern buildings. But according to over 40 documented witness accounts collected between 2003 and 2023, something else inhabits these spaces. Something that defies conventional explanation and challenges everything we think we know about what's possible in the shadows beneath our feet. They call it the Tunnel Nahual. The name itself is telling. In Mesoamerican tradition, a Nahual is a shapeshifter, a being that can transform between human and animal forms, or into something that exists in the liminal space between both. These weren't monsters in the traditional sense, but powerful entities connected to the spiritual world, sometimes protectors, sometimes tricksters, always dangerous to those who encountered them without proper preparation or respect. What makes the Tunnel Nahual accounts particularly compelling isn't just the number of witnesses or the consistency of their descriptions. It's the specific details that repeat across encounters spanning 2 decades, reported by people who never met each other, who worked different shifts in different parts of the tunnel system, who had no reason to collaborate on a hoax, and everything to lose by coming forward with stories that would make them sound unhinged. Let's start with the 2008 incident, because it's one of the few cases where physical evidence was captured, however briefly. A construction crew was working on a new drainage tunnel in the eastern section of the network, blasting through bedrock to expand the system. It was a Wednesday night in October, the crew working the graveyard shift to avoid disrupting daytime traffic patterns above. There were 7 men on the crew that night. 3 of them no longer work in any tunnel-related construction anywhere in the region. Miguel Cortez was the crew foreman. He'd worked underground for 15 years at that point, had seen cave-ins, equipment failures, had pulled injured men from collapsed sections, and kept his head during 2 separate gas leak evacuations. He wasn't someone prone to panic or flights of fancy. According to his statement, filed with both his employer and later with a private research group investigating anomalous phenomena, the incident began around 2 in the morning. The crew had just completed a controlled blast and were waiting for the dust to settle before moving in to clear debris. That's when Cortez smelled it. Copal incense. Strong enough that he thought at first someone had brought it down as some kind of joke, maybe a blessing for the new tunnel section. Some of the older workers still practiced traditional rituals, and Cortez respected that even if he didn't participate himself. But no one on the crew admitted to bringing incense, and the smell was growing stronger, coming from deeper in the newly opened section they just blasted through. Cortez sent 2 men forward with lights to check for any unexpected breaches into older tunnel sections or natural cave systems. You don't want surprises when you're working that far underground. The 2 men moved forward, their headlamps cutting through the settling dust, and that's when they saw it. Movement in the darkness beyond their lights. Something large, but moving in a way that immediately registered as wrong to both men. One of them, Rafael Duarte, had the presence of mind to pull out his phone and activate the camera. The photo he captured is grainy, shot in low light through a haze of rock dust, but you can make out a figure. It's standing upright bipedal, roughly human in size, but the proportions are subtly off in ways that make your brain struggle to process what you're seeing. The joints appear to bend backward. The knees, if that's what they are, angle in the opposite direction from human anatomy. The arms are too long, hanging past where the knees would be on a person. And the posture, the way it's standing, suggests something caught mid-transformation, frozen between 2 states of being. Duarte took 3 photos in rapid succession. In the first, the figure is distant and unclear. In the second, it appears closer, though neither man reported seeing it move. In the third photo, taken perhaps 2 seconds after the second, there's nothing but empty tunnel and settling dust. The figure had vanished without sound, without any indication of where it went, in a freshly blasted dead-end tunnel with only one way in or out. The crew filed an incident report, but the photos were dismissed as equipment malfunction or misinterpreted debris shadows. Duarte kept the images on his phone for 3 years before sharing them with researchers. He quit tunnel work 6 months after the incident. When asked why, he simply said he couldn't handle the smell anymore. Every tunnel smelled like copal incense to him after that night, even when no one else could detect it. But the 2008 incident, as disturbing as it was, wasn't the most psychologically damaging encounter on record. That distinction belongs to the 2015 maintenance crew case, an incident that left 3 men requiring counseling, and 1 taking early retirement from a job he'd held for 22 years. The crew was performing routine inspections in one of the older tunnel sections, areas that had been part of the original system built decades earlier. These tunnels had a different feel according to workers. The concrete was older, more worn, and there were sections where you could see they'd built over even older structures, foundations from previous centuries, maybe earlier. The city had been built and rebuilt many times, each era leaving its layers in the earth. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, which is worth noting because most encounters happen during night shifts when crews are smaller and the tunnels are quieter. But this incident occurred in full daylight above ground, with a 4-person team conducting standard maintenance sweeps. The crew leader, whose name was withheld from reports at his request, later testified that they smelled the copal incense approximately 10 minutes before the encounter. It started faintly, just a hint of something sweet and smoky in the recycled air of the tunnel. Within minutes, it had grown stronger, potent enough that all 4 men noticed and commented on it. They checked their air quality monitors, concerned about possible gas leaks or fume accumulation, but all readings came back normal. They continued their inspection, moving deeper into the tunnel section. The smell followed them, or perhaps they were moving toward its source. Then they saw the figure ahead, standing in the middle of the tunnel under one of the maintenance lights. At first glance, it appeared completely human. A man in dark clothing, standing motionless, facing away from them down the tunnel. The crew leader called out, asking if the person was authorized to be in this section. Workers sometimes took unauthorized breaks in the quieter tunnel areas, and while it wasn't allowed, it happened. The figure didn't respond. The crew leader called out again, louder this time, identifying himself and his team as maintenance personnel. The figure began to turn. Slowly, with a fluid rotating movement that one witness later described as mechanical, like watching a statue pivot on a turntable. It turned to face them, and that's when 3 of the 4 men began backing away instinctively, their minds processing what they were seeing before conscious thought could catch up. The figure had no face. Where features should have been, where eyes and nose and mouth should have formed the familiar landscape of human expression, there was only a smooth surface. Dark, reflective, one witness said it looked like polished obsidian. The ancient volcanic glass that pre-Columbian cultures had used for mirrors, for ritual blades, for carved representations of deities and supernatural beings. The smooth surface wasn't flat. It had subtle contours where a face should have been, suggestions of structure beneath, but no actual features. Just that dark, glassy smoothness that reflected their flashlight beams back at them. The figure stood there, facing them with its impossible non-face, and the smell of copal incense became overwhelming, thick enough that one crew member said later he could taste it, feel it coating the inside of his mouth and throat. Then the lights flickered. In the brief moment of darkness, the figure moved. Not walked, not ran. Moved. When the lights came back, less than a second later, it was gone. The tunnel stretched empty in both directions. No alcoves or side passages to hide in. No sound of retreating footsteps. Just the 4 men and the fading scent of incense. What makes these accounts particularly intriguing to cryptozoologists and researchers of anomalous phenomena isn't just the strangeness of the encounters themselves. It's the connection to the physical evidence found in the deepest, oldest parts of the tunnel system. During excavations for new tunnel sections, workers have uncovered pre-Columbian artifacts, pottery shards, tool fragments, and most notably, carved stone figures. These figures, some dating back over 1,000 years based on preliminary analysis, depict beings that match witness descriptions of the Tunnel Nahual with unsettling accuracy. Bipedal figures with backward-bending joints. Humanoid forms with smooth, featureless faces. Shapes caught mid-transformation between human and something else entirely. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a cryptozoologist who has studied the Tunnel Nahual accounts for over a decade, notes that the carved figures represent Nahualas in their transitional state. According to traditional beliefs, the moment of transformation was when these beings were most visible to human eyes, caught between worlds, between form. The rest of the time they existed in spaces humans couldn't perceive, or were human shapes convincing enough to walk among us unnoticed. The pattern of the copal incense is particularly significant. In Mesoamerican ritual practices, copal was burned as an offering to the gods, a way to communicate with the spiritual realm. The smoke was believed to carry prayers and create a bridge between the physical and supernatural worlds. That this scent precedes every encounter suggests the Tunnel Nahual either exists in or originates from a space that requires this ceremonial bridge to manifest fully in our reality. Skeptics argue that the tunnel environment creates ideal conditions for mass hysteria and misidentification. Poor lighting, strange acoustics, confined spaces, and the psychological stress of working underground can combine to produce hallucinations and false memories. The copal scent could be explained by water seeping through earth that contains organic compounds mimicking the smell. The figures could be shadows, other workers seen at angles that distort their appearance, even wildlife that has found its way into the tunnel system. But these explanations struggle to account for the photographs, limited as they are. They can't explain why the carved figures match modern witness descriptions so precisely, or why accounts separated by years and miles remain so consistent in their specific details. They don't address why experienced workers with decades of underground experience, people who have encountered every reasonable explanation for unusual sounds and sights in tunnel environments, are so deeply shaken by these experiences that they abandon careers and refuse to discuss what they saw. The Tunnel Nahual remains active according to the most recent reports from 2023. As the tunnel system continues to expand, as new sections are blasted through ancient earth and workers penetrate deeper into layers that haven't seen light in millennia, the encounters continue. Always preceded by that sweet, resinous scent. Always leaving witnesses changed, whether they see the backward-jointed figure in the darkness or the faceless form that reflects their lights back at them like obsidian mirrors. Perhaps what we're encountering in these tunnels isn't something new, but something very, very old. Something that has always existed in the spaces beneath our feet, in the darkness we've built our cities over and tried to forget. And perhaps, as we dig deeper and expand further into their territory, we're not discovering them. They're rediscovering us. Dr. Elena Fuentes had practiced child psychology in Oaxaca for 17 years before the Morales case forced her to question everything she thought she understood about memory, consciousness, and the boundaries between human and something else entirely. It began on a humid afternoon in late July of 2018, when Carolina Morales brought her 6-year-old daughter Isabella to the clinic with a complaint that seemed straightforward enough at first. The child had been having nightmares, her mother explained. Vivid and persistent dreams about living underground in darkness. But as Dr. Fuentes soon discovered, Isabella's nocturnal disturbances were only the beginning of something far more complex and deeply unsettling. The girl didn't describe her underground experiences as dreams at all. She spoke about them with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone recounting their morning routine. She had lived in the tunnels, she insisted, before she was Isabella, before she had these hands, before she could see colors the way she did now. When Dr. Fuentes asked her to elaborate, the child touched her own eyes and said something that would haunt the psychologist for years to come. She said she missed her old eyes because they could see in the dark without needing to see at all. That case would become the 12th and most thoroughly documented in a series of investigations that Dr. Fuentes had been quietly conducting since 2015. All 12 children lived in communities within a 30-kilometer radius of the ancient Zapotec tunnel systems that honeycomb the mountains outside Oaxaca City. All 12 were between the ages of 4 and 7. And all 12 described memories of previous lives spent in those tunnels as beings they struggled to identify as human. The first case had arrived almost by accident. A 4-year-old boy named Miguel had been referred to Dr. Fuentes for selective mutism. He spoke normally at home, his parents reported, but fell silent in social situations, at school, anywhere outside his immediate family. During their third session together, Miguel suddenly began drawing on the paper Dr. Fuentes had provided. He drew spirals within spirals, geometric patterns that interlocked in mathematically precise ways. The symbols meant nothing to Dr. Fuentes initially, but when she mentioned them to a colleague who specialized in pre-Columbian studies, the colleague's face went pale. The symbols were architectural markers, notations used by ancient Zapotec engineers to indicate depth, direction, and structural load-bearing points in tunnel construction. They had been found carved into walls, in the deepest, most restricted sections of the archaeological sites, areas that had only been excavated and documented within the last decade. Miguel had never visited the tunnels. His parents confirmed this repeatedly. He had never been to the archaeological sites, had never seen photographs or illustrations of these particular symbols in any book or educational material. When Dr. Fuentes asked Miguel where he had learned to draw these patterns, he looked at her with an expression of patient confusion, as though she had asked him where he learned to breathe. He said he remembered them from before, from when he lived below and helped mark the paths so the others wouldn't get lost. Over the next 3 years, 11 more children would come to Dr. Fuentes' attention through various referrals, parent concerns, and eventually, word of mouth as her quiet investigation became known in certain communities. 7-year-old Rosa spoke in what linguistic experts later identified as an archaic form of Zapotec, a dialect that had not been used conversationally for at least 500 years. She used it unconsciously, inserting phrases into her normal speech, especially when talking about the tunnels. The phrases were specific and technical, relating to ventilation, water flow, and the quality of stone. When Dr. Fuentes brought in a specialist in ancient Zapotec languages to interview Rosa, the scholar wept openly. The child was using grammatical constructions and vocabulary that he had only ever seen in fragmentary inscriptions, speaking a dead language with the fluency of a native speaker. 5-year-old twins, Javier and Lucia, drew identical maps of tunnel layouts during separate sessions conducted a week apart, neither child aware of what the other had drawn. Their maps matched each other perfectly, down to the placement of side chambers and the angle of descending passages. More disturbingly, their maps matched the actual layout of a section of tunnels that had been discovered by archaeologists only 6 months earlier, a find that had not been publicized, had not appeared in any media the children or their family could have accessed. The children's descriptions shared common elements that formed a pattern Dr. Fuentes could not ignore. They spoke of darkness that felt safe rather than frightening. They described moving through narrow spaces with ease, their bodies different, lower to the ground, more compact. Several mentioned the sound of many others around them, not quite voices, but a kind of collective awareness, a sense of belonging to something larger than individual consciousness. 6-year-old Paulo said he used to know what everyone was thinking without words. 4-year-old Estrella said she missed the feeling of stone against skin. That wasn't quite skin, the coolness of it, the way it held the memory of everyone who had touched it before. Dr. Fuentes maintained meticulous records. She documented every session, recorded interviews, collected the children's drawings, and consulted with experts across multiple disciplines. Archaeologists, linguists, anthropologists, neurologists, specialists in childhood development and memory formation. She was searching for a rational framework, a scientific explanation that could account for the stunning consistency of these accounts. Cryptomnesia, perhaps, hidden memories of information encountered and forgotten. Collective unconscious, archetypal imagery emerging from some shared cultural substrate. Suggestibility, though she controlled her interviews carefully to avoid leading questions. Fraud, though the children came from different communities, different families with no connection to each other, and their knowledge was too specific, too verifiable to be fabricated. None of these explanations held up under scrutiny. The children knew things they could not possibly know. They spoke languages they had never been taught. They described places they had never visited with absolute accuracy. And they all insisted, with varying levels of articulation depending on their age, that these were not fantasies, or dreams, or stories they had heard. These were memories of lives they had lived before, in bodies that were not human, in darkness that felt like home. But it was Isabella Morales who would push Dr. Fuentes past the point where scientific detachment was possible. Their sessions together revealed a child carrying memories so vivid and so alien that listening to her felt like receiving transmissions from another form of consciousness entirely. Isabella drew the same symbols the other children had drawn, spoke occasional phrases in archaic Zapotec, and described tunnel layouts with precision. But she also spoke about sensory experiences that had no human equivalent. She talked about tasting stone, about hearing through her skin, about a kind of seeing that happened in all directions at once. She said she had been smaller then, and there had been many like her, all moving together through the passages, all part of something she called the keeping. When Dr. Fuentes asked what they were keeping, Isabella struggled to find words. Finally, she said they were keeping the below safe from the above, keeping the old ways remembered, keeping the darkness alive. She said it was important work, and she had been good at it because she had the right kind of eyes then. Eyes that could see time as well as space, eyes that could watch the past and the future moving through the tunnels like water. The turning point came on a cool October night in 2019. Dr. Fuentes had arranged to stay with the Morales family as part of her investigation, with their full consent and cooperation. They had reported that Isabella's sleepwalking had intensified, and Dr. Fuentes wanted to observe and document these episodes directly. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, Isabella rose from her bed, eyes open, but unseeing in the conventional sense. Dr. Fuentes followed as the child walked with absolute confidence through the dark house and out into the night. Isabella led them through the sleeping town and into the hills, moving along paths that became increasingly rough and overgrown. Dr. Fuentes stayed close, filming with a night vision camera, her heart pounding as she followed this small child into terrain that would have been challenging to navigate in daylight. Isabella's father had woken and followed as well, and together they watched as the girl approached a section of hillside that looked like any other, covered in scrub vegetation and loose rock. Isabella stopped. She knelt down and began moving stones aside with methodical purpose, clearing away debris that looked like it had been undisturbed for decades. Within 20 minutes, she had revealed an opening, a gap in the rock face barely large enough for a child to squeeze through. Dr. Fuentes shone her flashlight into the darkness beyond and saw worked stone, the unmistakable signs of human construction, a passage leading down into the earth. This was the previously undiscovered chamber that would later be authenticated by archaeologists, a section of the tunnel system that had been sealed off by a rockfall sometime in the distant past. Isabella had found it while asleep, had led them directly to it across difficult terrain in complete darkness, had known exactly where to dig. But she would not enter. As soon as the opening was clear, Isabella stepped back. She stood very still for a long moment, and then she began to cry, soft, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from somewhere much older than 6 years. When her father tried to comfort her, she pulled away and looked at Dr. Fuentes with eyes that held a recognition that made the psychologist's blood run cold. Isabella spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She said she used to sleep in there, in the dark, curled up with the others. She said she remembered the feeling of stone beneath her, remembered the sound of breathing all around her, remembered being safe in the below. But she couldn't go back now, she said, because she had different eyes, and they wouldn't work right in there anymore. These new eyes needed light, needed color, needed to see the way humans see. And if she went back into that darkness, she might remember too much, might want to stay, might forget how to be Isabella entirely. Dr. Fuentes stood in that dark hillside at 3 o'clock in the morning, watching a 6-year-old child mourn for a life she claimed to have lived in a body that was not human, and felt the foundations of her scientific worldview crack and shift. She had spent years searching for explanations, constructing frameworks, trying to fit these cases into models that made sense within conventional understanding of consciousness and memory. But in that moment, confronted with Isabella's tears and the impossible knowledge that had led them to this hidden chamber, Dr. Fuentes had to admit that some phenomena resist explanation, that some experiences cannot be reduced to cognitive errors or cultural conditioning. The archaeological team that later explored the chamber Isabella had discovered found sleeping niches carved into the walls, dozens of them, each sized for bodies much smaller than adult humans. They found ventilation shafts engineered with sophistication that suggested deep understanding of airflow and underground climate control. And they found the symbols, the same geometric patterns that 12 children had drawn unprompted in Dr. Fuentes' office, carved into the stone in configurations that the children had reproduced with perfect accuracy. Dr. Fuentes continues her work, continues documenting cases, continues searching for frameworks that might help explain what she has witnessed. But she no longer expects to find definitive answers. She has seen too much, heard too many impossibly accurate descriptions, followed too many children who speak with the voices of something ancient and other. She has come to understand that consciousness may be far stranger and more persistent than science currently acknowledges, that memory might not be confined to a single lifetime, or even a single form, and that the boundaries we draw between human and non-human, between past and present, between possible and impossible, may be more permeable. The 12 children are growing older now. Some have begun to forget their tunnel memories as they move deeper into their current lives. Others, like Isabella, still carry those other experiences with them, still speak sometimes about the darkness they miss, the different eyes they used to have, the keeping they once participated in. Dr. Fuentes watches them navigate between two worlds, two sets of memories, two forms of consciousness. The human ear can detect sounds between 20 and 20,000 hertz, a range that has defined our understanding of the audible world since the dawn of our species. But beneath that threshold exists an entire spectrum of vibration that we cannot hear in the traditional sense, frequencies that bypass our ears entirely and speak directly to the most primitive parts of our nervous system. In the tunnels beneath the old city, something has been broadcasting at precisely 19 hertz for longer than anyone can remember. A subsonic pulse that researchers have documented with increasing alarm, and that those who've experienced it describe not as sound but as presence. The first verified recording came in 2003, when a team of acoustic engineers hired by the city's Historical Preservation Society descended into the network to assess structural integrity. They were measuring vibrations in the walls, looking for signs of settling or erosion, when their equipment began picking up something their ears could not. The seismographs showed a regular pattern, almost metronomic in its precision, occurring at intervals of roughly 4.2 seconds. When they adjusted their equipment to make the frequency audible, raising it several octaves, they heard what sounded like a distant drumbeat, steady and inexorable, emanating from somewhere deeper in the system. The engineer who led that initial survey, a man named Malcolm Hendricks with 27 years of experience in underground acoustic analysis, told his team to pack up early. In his official report, he cited equipment malfunction. In private conversations years later, he admitted that standing in that tunnel, feeling that rhythm in his chest cavity without hearing it, had triggered something he'd never experienced before. A fear so immediate and overwhelming that his hands shook as he coiled the cables. He described it as the certainty of being watched by something that had all the time in the world. For years, that recording sat in an archive, occasionally reviewed by curious researchers, but largely dismissed. Subsonic frequencies occur naturally in many environments. Wind moving through underground spaces, water flowing through hidden channels, the settling of ancient stone, all can produce vibrations below the range of human hearing. But the precision of this particular frequency, its unwavering regularity, and most troubling, its apparent intensification at specific depths, these elements didn't fit the pattern of natural phenomena. The 2019 expedition changed everything. A team of paranormal investigators, part of a larger project documenting unexplained phenomena in historic sites, spent 3 consecutive nights in the deepest accessible sections of the tunnel network. They came equipped with thermal imaging cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and crucially, specialized audio equipment capable of recording subsonic frequencies. Their stated goal was to capture evidence of the ghostly presences that local legends had attributed to the tunnels for generations. What they recorded over 9 hours of continuous documentation has become one of the most analyzed and debated pieces of audio evidence in the paranormal research community. The 19 Hz pulse was there, exactly as earlier researchers had documented. But this time, the extended recording period revealed something far more unsettling. Interspersed with the regular vibration were other sounds, organic and rhythmic in a different way. Breathing. The slow, deep respirations of multiple sources, captured in the subsonic range, but unmistakably biological in their pattern. The team leader, a woman named Teresa Volk, who had spent 15 years investigating reportedly haunted locations, described the experience in her testimony. She said they felt the pulse first, a sensation like standing too close to a massive subwoofer at a concert, but slower, deeper, more felt in the bones than the body. As they moved deeper into the tunnel system, following a passage that descended at a steady angle, the intensity increased. What had been barely perceptible at the entrance became almost overwhelming 300 meters down. She said it felt like standing inside the chest cavity of something enormous, feeling its heartbeat from the inside. But here's what transformed their documentation from curious to genuinely disturbing. The thermal imaging equipment, which can detect heat signatures from living bodies at considerable distances, showed absolutely nothing. The tunnels were empty except for the 5 members of the research team. No animals, no other humans, no heat sources that could account for the breathing sounds their audio equipment was capturing. They watched the thermal screens while their audio meters spiked with subsonic activity that had all the characteristics of respiration. Something was breathing in that space with them. Something that generated no heat. Something that existed in the realm of vibration and pressure without manifesting as physical presence. One team member, a sound technician named David Erasmus, had to be escorted out after 40 minutes. The official report states he experienced a panic attack, but his own account is more specific. He said the breathing began to synchronize with his own respiration, that he could feel his lungs matching rhythm with whatever was producing those subsonic pulses. He described the sensation of something massive pulling him into its respiratory cycle, drawing him into a shared breath that felt ancient and patient and utterly indifferent to his individual existence. The psychological impact of subsonic frequencies on human consciousness has been well documented in scientific literature. Vibrations in the range of 16 to 19 Hz can affect the human eyeball, causing visual distortions that manifest as peripheral shadows or phantom movements. They can trigger feelings of anxiety, dread, and the sensation of being watched. Some researchers have suggested that many reported hauntings occur in locations where naturally occurring subsonic frequencies create these psychological effects, rational explanations for supernatural experiences. But this explanation, while comforting in its scientific framework, fails to account for several elements of the tunnel recordings. Natural subsonic frequencies fluctuate. They rise and fall with changes in air pressure, temperature, and environmental conditions. The 19 Hz pulse in the tunnels maintains its frequency with a precision that suggests either artificial generation or something far stranger. And natural frequencies don't produce the complex patterns captured in 2019, patterns that acoustic analysis software identified as having structure, repetition, and what several analysts described as intentionality. The indigenous communities whose ancestors built the original structures that preceded the tunnel system have their own interpretation. When researchers brought the recordings to a gathering of traditional sound healers, the response was immediate and consistent across multiple independent witnesses. They identified the frequency as matching the ceremonial drumming used in protection rituals, rhythms designed to call forth guardian spirits and establish barriers against malevolent forces. These ceremonies, some dating back hundreds of years before European contact, used drums of specific dimensions to produce vibrations that practitioners claimed could open doorways between the physical and spiritual realms. An elder named James Whitebear, whose family had maintained these traditions through 7 generations, provided testimony that has been cited repeatedly in subsequent analyses. He said the frequency was not random but chosen, that his ancestors understood something about the relationship between vibration and consciousness that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. According to their teachings, certain frequencies don't just affect perception, they actually alter the boundary between what is present and what is possible. The 19 Hz pulse, he claimed, was a guardian tone, a vibration maintained across centuries to keep something contained, or perhaps to keep something called. Several expeditions since 2019 have attempted to trace the sound to its source, to identify some mechanical or geological explanation. Each has documented the same phenomenon, the progressive intensification of the pulse as depth increases. Researchers report that beyond a certain point, approximately 400 meters into the system along the oldest passages, the sensation becomes nearly intolerable. The chest feels compressed, breathing requires conscious effort, and the overwhelming certainty of being observed by something vast and patient becomes impossible to ignore. A geologist named Sandra Chen, part of a 2021 survey team, described reaching what they believed to be the deepest accessible chamber. She said the pulse there was so intense that it felt like being inside an engine, every molecule of air vibrating in sync. But more than the physical sensation, she reported an impression that has been echoed by others who've reached that depth. The sense that the vibration was not emanating from the walls or floor, but from something within the space itself, something using the entire tunnel system as a resonance chamber to broadcast its presence. No expedition has yet been able to proceed beyond that chamber. Not because of physical barriers, but because of the psychological effect. Team members report unanimous and overwhelming fear, the kind of primal terror that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to the survival instinct. It's the fear prey animals must feel when they sense a predator they cannot see. The certainty of being in the presence of something so far beyond human scale that remaining in its awareness feels like a form of erasure. The recordings continue to be analyzed, played at frequencies that make them audible to human ears. Late at night, in research facilities and home studios, people listen to the processed audio, trying to understand what message might be encoded in those subsonic pulses. Some claim to hear patterns that sound like language. Others report dreams of massive spaces beneath the earth, chambers that extend far deeper than any survey has mapped, places where something old and patient maintains its vigil, breathing in the darkness, waiting for whatever it has been called to guard against, or perhaps waiting to be called forth. The tunnels remain open to researchers, though access to the deeper sections now requires special permits and psychological screening. The 19 Hz pulse continues, unwavering in its frequency, felt in the chest and bones of everyone who descends into that ancient darkness, a rhythm that might be protection or invitation. A heartbeat that has no source, but never stops, never wavers, never reveals what massive presence might be drawing breath in that eternal night beneath our feet. The cave system beneath the volcanic mountains of the Pacific Northwest has been mapped and remapped countless times over the past century. Every tunnel, every chamber, every narrow passage has been documented, photographed, and cataloged with the kind of precision that modern technology allows, which makes what happened in March of 2021 all the more impossible to explain. Marcus Webb was not some amateur thrill seeker. At 42 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades investigating paranormal phenomena with a scientific approach that had earned him respect even among skeptics. He carried calibrated equipment, maintained detailed records, and never made claims he couldn't substantiate. When he arrived in the small town of Cascade Ridge that spring, he came with proper permits, professional gear, and a local guide named Thomas Whitehorse, who had been exploring those caves since childhood. Thomas knew every twist and turn of those tunnels. He had guided dozens of research teams, tourist groups, and documentary crews through the volcanic passages without incident. The two men entered the caves on March 15, 2021, at approximately 9:30 in the morning. They were expected back before sunset. The footage recovered from their GoPro cameras has been analyzed by experts in multiple fields, from geologists to video forensic specialists, and none can fully explain what the devices recorded. The first 3 hours of video show exactly what you would expect. 2 experienced men moving through familiar territory, their headlamps cutting through the darkness, their conversation casual and professional. Marcus commented on the temperature readings, the electromagnetic fluctuations that sometimes occur naturally in volcanic rock formations. Thomas pointed out mineral deposits, ancient lava flows frozen in time, the natural sculptures that water and heat had carved over millennia. Nothing about those early hours suggested anything unusual was about to occur. At the 2-hour and 47-minute mark, things changed. Thomas stopped walking, his headlamp being fixed on a section of wall that appeared identical to the dozens of other rock faces they had passed. But something had caught his attention. The footage shows him running his hand along the stone, tracing what appears to be a seam. a crack that seemed almost too straight to be natural. Marcus moved closer, his camera capturing Thomas's growing excitement. In 17 years of guiding expeditions through these caves, Thomas had never seen this opening. And he had walked past this exact spot hundreds of times. The gap in the rock wall was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Marcus's breathing became audible on the recording as they discussed whether to proceed. Thomas's voice carried a note of uncertainty that would prove to be prescient. He suggested they mark the location and come back with additional team members. But Marcus, with the enthusiasm of a researcher who sensed a genuine discovery, convinced him that a preliminary look would be harmless. They would document what they found and retreat within 30 minutes. They entered the gap at 12 minutes past 1 in the afternoon. The passage beyond was short, no more than 15 feet long, before it opened into a chamber. And it was this chamber that would make the footage required viewing for everyone from paranormal investigators to mainstream archaeologists, all struggling to explain what the cameras captured. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose to about 12 feet at its highest point. But it was not the shape or size of the chamber that made both men fall silent when their lights illuminated it. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in small obsidian mirrors. Not mirror-like rocks, not reflective mineral deposits. Actual manufactured mirrors, each one perfectly circular, approximately 3 inches in diameter, polished to an impossible sheen. And they were arranged in spiral patterns that flowed across the walls like frozen whirlpools, drawing the eye inward toward centers that seemed to recede deeper than the wall surface should allow. Marcus's camera recorded his hand reaching out to touch one, his fingers trembling slightly as they made contact with the cold, smooth surface. His voice, barely above a whisper, counted them. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands. Thomas's footage shows him making a slow circle, his camera sweeping across the chamber. The spirals of mirrors caught the light from their headlamps and seemed to multiply it, creating a disorienting effect where reflections bounced and fragmented until it became difficult to tell which direction was which. His breathing had quickened. He suggested, more firmly this time, that they needed to leave and report this finding to the proper authorities. But Marcus had already set up his equipment, pulling out his EMF readers, his thermal cameras, his audio recording devices. The readings he was getting made no sense. Electromagnetic fluctuations far beyond what volcanic rock should produce. Temperature variations that seemed to shift and move around the chamber like invisible currents. And a sound, barely on the edge of human hearing, registering at 19 hertz. The next 8 minutes of footage show Marcus becoming increasingly animated, talking rapidly into his camera about the implications of the find, the questions it raised about who could have created such a space, and when, and why. Thomas remained near the entrance passage, his camera occasionally catching Marcus in the background, moving from mirror to mirror, taking measurements, recording observation. And then, at the 8-minute and 33-second mark, Marcus stopped talking mid-sentence. Both cameras captured what happened next from different angles. Marcus stood perfectly still, his light fixed on one particular spiral of mirrors. His voice, when he spoke again, had changed. The excitement was gone, replaced by something that sounded like confusion, or perhaps fear. He said the mirrors were showing him something. Thomas asked what he saw. Marcus didn't answer directly. He only said that it wasn't possible, that the reflection was showing him a version of the chamber with doorways that weren't there, with symbols on the walls that he couldn't see when he looked directly at them, only when he looked at the mirror's surface. Thomas moved closer, and his camera captured Marcus's face in profile. The researcher's eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the obsidian surface before him. Thomas's voice became insistent. They needed to leave. Now, down. Whatever this place was, whatever these mirrors were, they could document it properly with a full team, with proper support. But Marcus seemed unable to look away. He reached toward the mirror again, his fingers spreading across its surface, and his voice dropped to a whisper that the camera's microphone barely caught. He said he could see himself, but different. Older, or maybe younger. He couldn't tell. And there were others in the reflection, standing behind him, though when he turned to look, the chamber was empty except for Thomas. The guide's training and experience overrode his curiosity at that moment. The footage shows him gripping Marcus's shoulder, physically turning him away from the mirrors. insisting they were experiencing some kind of atmospheric effect, perhaps gas from a volcanic vent, perhaps carbon dioxide buildup affecting their perception. They were leaving immediately. Marcus seemed to snap out of his trance, nodding, gathering his equipment with hands that shook as he packed the devices away. Thomas's camera captured the researcher taking one last look at the chamber. A long, slow pan that recorded the spiral patterns, the impossible number of mirrors, the way the reflections seemed to create depth where none should exist. They were moving toward the exit passage when both cameras captured it. A shadow, but not a normal shadow cast by an object blocking light. This shadow moved against the light source, sliding across the wall of mirrors from left to right, even though their headlamps were stationary. It had a shape, roughly humanoid but stretched and distorted, and where it passed over the obsidian surfaces, the reflections seemed to darken, as if the mirrors themselves were absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Marcus's camera swung wildly as he turned to track the movement. His breathing had become rapid, almost panicked. Thomas shouted something incomprehensible, a word in a language that linguistic experts later identified as a traditional phrase in his native tongue, one used for warding off evil spirits. The shadow continued its impossible movement, and then, at the 16-minute and 49-second mark, both cameras recorded something that has never been adequately explained. The shadow stopped moving and seemed to expand, growing larger, rising from the wall into three-dimensional space. And in that moment, every single mirror in the chamber reflected not the men or their lights, but only darkness. Perfect, absolute darkness, as if the mirrors had become windows into empty space. The final 17 seconds of footage are chaos. Both cameras jerking, bouncing, the audio overwhelmed by static, and underneath it, a deep, thrumming pulse at 19 hertz that rose in volume until it dominated the recording. Marcus's voice, distorted and breaking, shouting something about the walls, about the spirals, moving, spinning. Thomas's camera captured a brief glimpse of Marcus's face, eyes wide with terror, mouth open, and then the image fractured, breaking into geometric patterns that looked almost like the spiral arrangements of the mirrors themselves. At 17 minutes and 6 seconds, both cameras cut to static simultaneously. The rescue team entered the cave 6 hours later, when Marcus and Thomas failed to return at the scheduled time. They found the gap in the wall exactly where the GPS coordinates from the cameras indicated it should be. They found the chamber beyond. And they found all of the equipment. Marcus's backpack, carefully set against the wall. Thomas's gear arranged in a neat pile. Both GoPro cameras, still recording, their memory cards full of static. The men's water bottles, their spare batteries, their notebooks and pens and instruments. Everything except Marcus Webb and Thomas Whitehorse themselves. The chamber was exactly as the footage had shown it. The same size, the same shape, the same hundreds or thousands of small obsidian mirrors arranged in those impossible spirals. The rescue team documented everything, taking photographs, measurements, samples of the rock, and even carefully removing one of the mirrors for analysis. The obsidian dated to approximately 8,000 years ago, but the precision of its polishing suggested modern manufacturing techniques. The chamber itself showed no tool marks, no indication of how it had been carved from the solid volcanic rock, and there was no other exit, no hidden passage, no place where two grown men could have gone. The search continued for 3 weeks. Specialists brought in ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, dogs trained to track human scent. They found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no trace that Marcus and Thomas had ever existed beyond that chamber full of mirrors. The cave system was remapped entirely, every tunnel verified against the existing charts. The chamber appeared on the new maps, its location carefully noted and marked. And then something impossible happened. 6 months later, when a research team attempted to revisit the chamber, they could not find it. The gap in the wall was gone, the rock face solid and unbroken. Ground-penetrating radar showed no void space, no chamber beyond. They brought in the members of the original rescue team, the people who had stood inside that room, who had photographed those mirrors. Everyone agreed on the location. Everyone remembered the same details. But the chamber was not there. It has not been found since, despite multiple attempts by teams using the exact GPS coordinates recorded by the original camera. Marcus Webb's wife, Sarah, remained in Cascade Ridge for months after her husband's disappearance, refusing to believe he was gone. organizing search parties, hiring private investigators. She returned home to Oregon in late September of 2021 to a house full of her husband's research, his equipment, his notes about places where the normal world seemed to grow thin. She told friends she heard his voice sometimes, in dreams, calling out but unable to form words. And then, on a Tuesday evening in mid-September, 6 months to the day after Marcus had entered that cave, Sarah's phone rang. The number showed as unknown. When she answered, there was no voice on the other end, only breathing. Slow, steady breathing, and underneath it, so low she felt it more than heard it, a thrumming pulse at 19 hertz, the same frequency Marcus had recorded in the Chamber of Mirrors. She said hello, then Marcus's name, then Thomas's name. The breathing continued. For 43 seconds, she listened, tears running down her face, her hand gripping the phone so tightly, her knuckles turned white. And then the line went dead. The phone company had no record of the call. The number could not be traced. Sarah reported it to the investigators handling her husband's case, but there was nothing they could do with such evidence. Some said it was a cruel prank. Others suggested grief-induced hallucination. But Sarah had recorded that final detail, that frequency, on her own phone when she held it up to the receiver. 19 hertz. The exact same reading Marcus had documented in a chamber that now exists only in recovered footage and the memories of people who swear they stood inside it. There are questions that refuse to quiet themselves, riddles that grow louder the longer they go unanswered. In the tunnels beneath this valley, those questions have taken on weight and substance, pressing against the darkness like something trying to be born. What is the true nature of the consciousness that seems to inhabit these passages? Hundreds of witnesses across decades describe the same sensation, a presence that feels ancient beyond measure, something that observes without eyes and considers without thought as we understand it. Psychics who have never met, separated by generations and geography, report receiving identical summons, the same psychic pull toward specific chambers deep underground. They describe it not as a voice, but as a knowing, an invitation extended from something that exists in the spaces between awareness and void. The consistency is troubling. When disparate minds report the same impossibility, we are left with uncomfortable options, none of them offering comfort. The pre-Columbian cultures knew something. The archaeological evidence makes this undeniable. They sealed certain passages with care that bordered on reverence or terror, perhaps both. Stone barriers constructed with astronomical precision, positioned at angles that suggest knowledge of what lay beyond. Markings worn in languages we have only partially deciphered, but the intent transcends translation. Keep out. Keep it in. Some boundaries exist for reasons that outlast the civilizations that established them. In 2023, research teams equipped with the latest thermal imaging technology captured something that has yet to be adequately explained. Massive heat signatures emanating from chambers that should be empty, that according to all previous expeditions are empty. Temperature differentials suggesting the presence of something generating warmth on a scale that defies conventional understanding. The data has been reviewed, verified, and quietly archived. No press releases followed these findings. No academic papers appeared in peer-reviewed journals. The silence around these discoveries is itself revealing. Local authorities have begun restricting tunnel access without public explanation. Permits that were once routinely granted now face indefinite delays. Historical tour routes have been quietly closed, redirect barriers appearing overnight with minimal signage. When pressed, officials cite structural concerns, environmental protection protocols, vague references to ongoing studies. But longtime residents notice the pattern, the systematic sealing of entry points that have been accessible for generations. Something has changed in how those in power view what lies below. Indigenous elders maintain positions they have held for centuries. Some things are meant to remain below. They speak with certainty born not from superstition but from inherited knowledge, wisdom passed through bloodlines that predate written history. The tunnels house something neither wholly alive nor dead, they insist. Something that predates human occupation of the valley, perhaps predates humanity itself. Their words carry the weight of testimony, of ancestral memory maintained through careful oral tradition. When asked directly what dwells in the deepest chambers, they become quiet. Not evasive, but respectful of boundaries that should not be crossed, even in speech. The tunnels extend far deeper than any expedition has successfully traveled. Ground-penetrating radar reveals the truth of this, mapping passages that descend into depths where air pressure alone would make human exploration impossible without specialized equipment. The images show networks of corridors stretching kilometers beneath the surface, intersecting in patterns too regular to be entirely natural. And there are chambers down there, spaces of such immense volume that the imaging software initially flagged them as errors. Caverns large enough to house something immense, hollow spaces in the earth that wait in perfect darkness. What could require chambers of such scale? The question haunts researchers who have studied the data. Natural cave systems exist at impressive sizes, certainly, but these spaces show evidence of excavation, of intentional expansion. Something created room for itself down there, or something was given space by those who came before us. Architects working with purpose we can only guess at. Recent testimony from the last authorized expedition to reach the lower levels speaks of sounds. Not the expected drip of water or settling of stone, but rhythms that suggested breathing. The slow inhalation and exhalation of something operating on a timescale divorced from human experience. Equipment malfunctioned at specific depths, cameras failing in sequence as if observed by attention that did not welcome documentation. 2 team members reported dreams for months afterward, identical visions of tunnels extending beyond darkness into something worse, into a quality of space that felt aware. We must confront the possibility that some mysteries resist investigation not because answers do not exist, but because we may not survive the knowing of them. Human curiosity is celebrated as our defining virtue, the impulse that drives discovery and progress. But perhaps there are territories where that curiosity becomes liability, where the act of knowing changes the knower in ways that cannot be undone. The tunnels may house truths too vast for human neurology to process, concepts that would shatter the framework of meaning we use to navigate reality. The consciousness in the tunnels, if consciousness is even the correct term, appears content to wait. No aggression in its nature, no reaching upward toward the surface world. Simply presence, patient and eternal, occupying depths we have barely begun to map. But the identical summons received by psychics suggests intention, purpose operating according to logic we do not share. It calls to certain individuals across time, extending invitations we do not understand for reasons we cannot fathom. The sealed passages left by ancient peoples stand as warnings we are only now beginning to appreciate. They knew something, witnessed something, understood dangers that made them invest tremendous effort in containing access to the deep places. We approach those same depths with tools they never possessed, but perhaps without wisdom they maintain. Progress in technology does not always align with progress in judgment. The question remains hanging in the darkness of those unexplored chambers. What waits in the depths? What has always waited, long before we arrive to ask questions? And what will continue waiting long after we are gone? The tunnels remember everything and forget nothing, holding secrets in stone and shadow, patient as only the ancient can be patient. And somewhere far below, in chambers large enough to house immensities we have not imagined, something listens to our questions, and does not answer, does not need to answer, content in the knowledge that some boundaries exist for excellent reasons, and some mysteries are meant to remain exactly that, untouched and inviolate in the eternal dark. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.